In this lesson, we're going to look at how to create explicit iterators for both lists and files. It's very simple to do. Let's start a new program. We're going to call it iternext.py, since we're talking about an iter function and a next function. The first thing let's do is let's create a small list, because we don't want to make it too long, since we're going to manually iterate through it. We'll set up a list containing 3 numbers, 1, 2, and 3. To create an iterator, an explicit iterator, we'll call it that, to distinguish between the implicit or an internal iterator that is also created with for loops, for example, we simply create a variable and we call the function iter with a sequence of data, such as a list. Once we've done that, then our variable it now becomes an iterator tied to this sequence of data. If we want to display the first element, we can do it in one of 2 ways. The first way is to use an object that's part of the iterator object, and it's called next, but notice that it has 2 underscores before the word next and after the word next, and yet those last 2 are before the parentheses signifying a function call. So that's kind of awkward, but let's see what it does. So we're going to save it, bring up our command window, run our program. Notice it takes us to the first element. That's what next does. And then, of course, the print command will display it, or the print function will display it. That's one way to move the iterator through the sequence. But an easier way to do it is to use the external function next and call it with the iterator. So if we do this, we'll get the same result in a much easier to call form. So you see, we still get 1. So once we've started through, we can simply move through the rest of the sequence just by calling the next function. So there's the first element, there's the second element, there's the third element. Let's clear the screen. And so there are our 3 elements. What's interesting is what happens when we try to go one more. When we try to go beyond the end, the explicit iterator crashes and we get an exception saying that we've reached the stop iteration point. We've reached the end of the sequence and a stop iteration message is returned. When we use an implicit method such as a for loop, the for loop is programmed to know to stop before the stop iteration exception is thrown. And we're going to talk more in the course about exception handling. And we'll cover how to handle iterator exceptions in that chapter. But for now, just understand that internally, that exception is dealt with so that we don't see it when we run a for loop, for example. The iterator that's implicit in the for loop knows to stop before the stop iteration exception is thrown. Files are handled the same way that lists are handled, except a file object is an iterator. So let me show you what I mean by that. We'll create a file object, we'll call it file it, and we'll call next on the file iterator, and it should display the first element of the file, which is the grade 100, I believe. Let's clear the screen here, just like so. Notice it also added a new line there. We might want to get rid of that in subsequent prints by setting end equal empty string, like so. But notice I didn't have to use the iter function with the file object or anything, because a file object automatically is set up as an iterator. So we can iterate through a file exactly like we iterate through a list, for example, using next. And I'll stop there because the functionality is exactly the same for files as it is for lists. So to summarize, when we want to create an explicit iterator, we first have to have some sequence of data to iterate over. Then we call the iter function if we're working with a list, for example. And then to access an element, we simply call the next function with the iterator object as our argument. The only difference for file iterators is we don't have to call the iter function, because when we open a file, that file object is automatically set up as an iterator. So with that, we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to discuss iterators and dictionaries.